Text of Scripture this morning is Mark 7, verse 24 and following. It's one of my favorite little stories about Jesus, and I'll tell you why later. The story takes place after a pretty intense debate between Jesus and the Pharisees. Now, these things carry a lot of weight in that culture. It's not like he was having an argument with a bunch of preachers. What would that matter, really? No, he was having an argument with people who had a lot to say about the politics of the region, who actually had a lot to say in the end about whether he lived or whether he died. So after this rather intense confrontation, Jesus set out, went away, and he went up to the region of Tyre. That's as far north as he ever got in the Gospels. He entered a house, but he didn't want anybody to know that he was there. But he could not escape notice. So a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter. But Jesus said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the puppies." The woman answered him, "Sir, even the puppies under the table eat the children's crumbs." So he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So the woman went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon was all gone. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. I've always liked that story. I really have. And the reason I like it is because Jesus was wrong. Really, that's just fabulous. I like that Jesus was wrong because I'm a preacher's kid and I spent my whole life competing with Jesus. And he was wrong. It's great. I mean, what would Jesus do? Insult this poor woman who's desperate. That's what Jesus would do in this case. It's actually kind of comforting to me in a way, in a perverse way I'm willing to grant. Doesn't even help that the Greek word there for dog is actually puppy, kind of a little diminutive, cute little thing. No, it's still pretty much an insult if he says to the Syrophoenician woman that she's like the little puppies, not like the kid. We all know that's more important, really. But as I've grown older, I've had a little bit more compassion for Jesus in this case. I mean, really, he was tired. He was bone tired. He'd traveled all the way up to Tyre, and he goes into a house, and he really wants to relax. Now, what I want you to picture is not a house with a door like ours, but rather kind of an open courtyard where you walk in and you're really sitting and you're relaxing. So it's not like this woman sort of crashed the house. That's not the image. There he was, basically wanting to share a beer with his disciples, something along those lines. He's trying to relax, and this woman comes in and starts pressuring him and asking questions. I know what it's like to feel tired and then pressed with questions. This may be a little lighthearted, but our grandson Zion spent the night last night. And after a fairly long day yesterday, I made it home, and I walk in the door. I can barely get the groceries down, and Saba, come read. So I sit down and I open this book, and A is for apple. Why is it red, Saba? Why is it red? C is for car. Is that a hard C? Is that a hard C? Well, we eventually moved on to another book, the 500 Hat book by Dr. Seuss. Great old story. How come that one doesn't have a hat, Saba? Saba, is that a good king or a bad king? I don't know. What do you think? I think it's a good king. Turn the page. Saba, is that a bad king or a good king? Well, honey, it's the same king. So then we move to dinner. We're setting up the table, and he goes, Saba, who sits over there? I said, well, that's my seat. Who's over there? I said, that's Safta. And here? I said, that's where you're going to sit, Zion. Who's over there? I said, no one. Why, Saba? Why? We've been there, and finally there is, by the way, and this is a tip I'm going to give you for absolute free. Okay? There's only one thing to do at a moment like that. Eventually you just look at the kid and you say, because the moon is made of green cheese. that's the answer, we're done. Particularly when they're trying to get out of some discipline or another. So that is one reason why I understand Jesus in this story, the fact that he was bone tired, exhausted, and just wanted to kick back, and this woman really was pressing in, maybe making him feel guilty, something along those lines. But the other reason is because over the years I developed what you might call a low Christology. It's a technical theological term, and I'll explain it. Christians have historically believed in the doctrine of the two natures of Christ. That is to say, Jesus is fully God and Jesus is fully human. Now, the way that doctrine works out, they're not separable. You can't pull those apart. So Jesus is always both of those. But in reality, when we talk about Jesus, we can't talk out of both sides of our mouth at the same time. You can't hold those things in your hand at the same time. So we usually lean one way or another. And over the years, I've leaned towards a low Christology, which is to say, I look at Jesus as very human. Very human. He gets exhausted, he gets frustrated, he gets tired, doesn't want to be asked questions. He feels fear and hurt and despair. This is a low Christology. No super Jesus here who can take on any problem and it really does not matter to him at all. He's impervious to pain and hurt. That's not what we're dealing with here when we have a low Christology. And that's important to me because if Jesus is this high, magnificent, purely God man, well then this story isn't written for you or for me. It becomes almost irrelevant. It's about some Superman that lived 2,000 years ago and did a bunch of stuff, and okay, we have this thing about if we believe it, we get to go to heaven. But other than that, the story has very little to do with our lives. But if it's a low Christology, then we recognize that Jesus is in fact connected to the Spirit of God in ways that you and I can be connected. Jesus almost becomes prototypical for a new human being, the new thing that we're trying to become. Because this is what God's about. I have a friend who says we ought to put a big baby up there instead of what she calls the big T. This is an Episcopalian priest, mind you. Big baby. Why? Because Jesus was born for us. Born to live and show us the way. That's what you get from a low Christology. Now, to be fair, I'll preach sometime about the other side of the coin and the gorgeous things we get from a higher Christology. But that said, I begin to understand Jesus because he is very human, and this story has something to do with us. Now, Jesus at the beginning here had conflict with the Pharisees, and it's the kind of conflict that could affect his future. The kind of thing that could shut down his ministry, the kind of thing that could end him up being crucified. The way the conflict had grown had become desperate. It was real, and Jesus was impacted by it, and so he left town and made it up to Tyre. Wanted to be left alone. Now, we all know that when we feel a sense of conflict, when we're really in the midst of it, that shuts down about every creative impulse that we have in our bodies. Ask somebody who does music or art for a living, where that's really their life. What happens at those moments when they are in deep personal conflict? It's like it shuts the spigot off. It's difficult, it's hard. And it's not an accident that the Gospel of Mark is telling this story about conflict and the shutdown of Jesus' creativity, which is really how he starts with that woman. When we're dealing with the story of taking care of a little girl. You remember Jairus' daughter, chapter 6, just 2 chapters earlier. That was a little girl that Jesus healed to care for the nation of Israel. This is a Gentile girl and intends to care for the whole world. The feeding of the 5,000 that we talked about last week, there were 12 bags or parcels left at the end, and that represents the tribes of Israel. But the feeding of the 4,000, it was 4 and then 5,000. No, we had 7 bags left. And that's about the complete number of the universe. So Mark is paralleling all these stories, trying to tell us that Jesus is about healing both the nation of Israel and healing the Gentiles as well. The gospel's about both. And why a little girl? Because that is the creative future of the nations. I mean, the little girls. It's they that are going to birth the new hope and the tomorrow. It's in their wombs that the future will be nurtured and brought into being. For the Gospel of Mark, the little girl, healing the little girl, is about the future of humanity, about the future possibilities beyond the horror of the Roman Empire, the injustice of the Jewish leadership. This is about something bigger than one little girl. It's about that creative spark that lives in each and every one of us. A thing that touches the Spirit of God, that receives it so that it's able to gestate and grow within each and every one of us. That's what's at stake. It's at stake in your life, and it's at stake in mine. And at this moment of conflict, Jesus' future is in question. Everything's in doubt. His creativity is shut down. He can't do the healing. He doesn't want to get there when this story starts. We know how that feels, don't we? We know how it feels to be facing something that feels like reality. We talked about it last week. We talked about the fact that there are moments when we end up in relationships that for whatever reason, we cannot seem to break through and restore. It's so hard. And we figure, well, that's it. Or we face financial realities, either as a church or as individuals or certainly as a nation. And we look at what's limiting, what we cannot possibly do. We pull our hair out and say there's nothing to be done. But God doesn't play a zero-sum game. That's not how the universe operates. Instead, in the midst of that kind of shut-down, closed-up world, it is in the nature of God to break through with something fresh and new. Important themes need to be repeated. The Gospel of Mark knows it. It's why it keeps coming up. When you meet with a difficult reality, when you meet with a brick wall, God is about breaking through. Now, God doesn't make nonsense of the brick wall, doesn't say, oh, that wasn't there. It's not magic. That wouldn't do us any good. That's the high Christology Jesus. No, instead it's in God's nature to break through, to transcend what we think the reality is and do something novel, fresh, and new. It's the sort of thing we have to count on when we meet resistance, when we meet conflict, when we meet hopelessness. I've seen it actually in the last week or so here. I don't want to talk about what's going on in congregation with our finances and stuff, because I think we've made some progress there, but just 2 little stories about 2 staff people. John Steiner and Barbara and I were speaking on Friday night after Chant Fest, and we're trying to figure out, okay, I'm going on sabbatical, right, from September through December, and I'm actually going to be out of town on the first Friday of the month in August, and so that means I won't be there for 5 months, and that was a deep concern to us. How's this thing going to move forward? What are we going to do? How do we operate to make it go? And John said to me, well, you know, whenever I meet something like this, when there's, you know, something that looks like it's the end, well, then I always figure that's an opportunity to do something fresh and new. That's an opportunity to reinvent. And who knows, maybe it'll be better, he said. The other story's about Jan. So when we had the congregational meeting a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the finances and how that really threatened the associate pastor position, a number of you kindly expressed your lack of comfort with that to Jan. Because after all, we call it the associate pastor position, but, you know, it's Jan's job. Right? So Jan was with a group of elders on Thursday night, and she said to them, I'm comfortable talking about this, about what's right for the church, when it's not right, what it is that we're doing. I'm comfortable talking about this because I know that when this goes away, there will be something new and perhaps more exciting to do than what I'm doing here. Now, I've known that for some time, so Jan and I talk about this pretty comfortably as we think about what's best for the congregation and best for the church. But she has that sense that there is a fresh new future, not a brick wall facing her. That's a hopeful stance. It's the kind of stance we would have hoped for out of Jesus at this moment, as he felt creatively pressed in, pulled down. So my question is this: what changed Jesus? I mean, really, what's at stake is whether or not you and I can break through that moment when we feel like there's a brick wall in front of us and nothing we can do about the realities of the world facing us. Nothing we can do about the disappointments we feel, nothing we can do about the reality of our finances, nothing we can do about the politics of the nation or the horrifying wars of the world when we meet that kind of brick wall. What's at stake is whether or not we can await on God, break through, and find what the novel new solution will be. God doesn't play a zero-sum game. God creates new at moments like that. So what changed Jesus in this story? How did he get from shut down to open-hearted? Let me read to you the story. From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house, and he didn't want anybody to know he was there. But he couldn't escape notice. So a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. Understand, she shouldn't even be talking to him as a man. But as a Gentile, that's outrageous. But she didn't let that stop her. She begged him to cast out the demon from her daughter. So he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the puppies." But she answered him, "Sir, even the puppies under the table eat the children's crumbs." Now let's listen. So then Jesus said to her, "For saying that, not for her faith, but for saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." What was the tone of voice, is my question. Was it, "Oh, for saying that, just go. The demon's left your daughter"? Was it like the unjust judge? Jesus was just more ticked off and wanted to get her out of there? I don't think so. It seems more to me that this woman touched Jesus' heart, that Jesus was able to listen. That the idea that a little girl, someone who's going to gestate the future, was hurt, distorted, somehow touched the life and the love of Jesus. And so his heart opened as he listened. That's the key for us. Keeping an open heart. Every week, I try to preach about what God does in this world. That's what I think the gospel is. I remember a preaching professor I had, Betty Ochtermeyer, and she used to yell out from the back of the room, "Preach about what God does, Sam." And so what God does is move into the world and carry us from this place where we are shut down, where the little girl in us can't find any way to conceive. and instead moves through us and allows us to become fresh and new. How? Each week I tell you that God is about this, but how? This is a story about that. A story about a God that operates in us when we withdraw from the conflict, when we sit quietly and let our hearts listen for the Spirit of God. This is where it begins. This is how we break through. We withdraw, sit, listen, and wait on the Spirit of God to bring that novel moment forward. Now, you can sit and listen in different places. For me, it's usually Jan's office. When Jan comes into my office, we kind of work on administrative stuff. But for whatever reason, when I just go in and I sit down in her office chair, and we just talk, somehow some new idea comes about that breaks through. If we're paying attention, if we're looking for it. And that's true wherever you are. Whatever's going on in your life, whatever brick wall you think you've met, the promise of the gospel, and this is a promise, if it's not true, then we should be going home and earning an honest living. If we sit and we listen for the creative voice of God, it is in God's nature to bring some new life out of what we think is dead and gone. It's a promise. It's why this is the greatest story ever told. It's not told because we have super Jesus flying through the sky with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. It's told because Jesus connects to the power of God, and you and I can too. Is it that simple? Is it that simple? I believe it is. It's as simple as withdrawing and listening for what the Spirit would have us create that's new. It's both that simple and requires enormous courage. It's why you and I need to do it together. It's why when we meet disappointment and disease and challenges of any type, we come to be with one another, get support from one another. As we learn how to listen and to wait and to actively seek whatever that next thing might be. It's why the story is told. You have the creative power of the Spirit of God within you, and with it the hope for a new humanity, one rising, breaking free of everything that binds us. And the reason for that is that the power of God is always operating in this world, unfolding into the next surprising and gorgeous thing. All we got to do is believe it.